history tells us that when governments have imposed censorship laws, most often they end up being used against minority social groups.
In his book, Regulating Free Speech in the Digital Age, senior policy analyst and author David Bromell argues strongly that legislation and/or censorship won't actually solve the problem of hate speech, hurt and harm. Instead, he promotes the idea of counter-speech and a return to civility.
I think we have to start by distinguishing, as New Zealand law currently does, between hate crimes and hate speech. So a hate crime involves committing an offence that is already illegal. It might be assault and injury or damage to property. And what makes it a hate crime is that it is manifestly motivated by hatred. But the actual criminal act is independently illegal. Hate speech is different from that. The act of speaking is not independently illegal. The concern is not with hate as a motivation, but with hate as a likely effect.
So this is a critical point.
This is absolutely critical.
Let's come up with a scenario here so we don't offend anyone. Let's call it the mask religion. Give me an example of hate speech which is acceptable by, if you like, insulting the masked people versus incitement of violence towards the masked people, something that would indeed be illegal.
So this would mean that I would be committing an offence if I stirred up discrimination against members of the mask religion by, for example, urging people not to rent homes to them or not employ them in a workplace. That would be an offence under our human rights legislation. It would be an offence if I urged people to harass them publicly or to act violently towards them, to assault them or to kill them. But it would not be an offence if I wrote a column for a newspaper, for example, that exposed the ideas of the mask religion as nonsense or as hypocrisy, or if I made jokes about the mask religion or drew a cartoon about the mask religion.
Okay, let's take this offline, if you like, to the streets, because the two are connected. What if I was to say to one of the masked people, you're all smelly, you're from a degenerate background, I hate you?
Yeah, that would be a failure of civility. And I would rather not live in a community where that kind of mouthing off and verbal abuse happened in public places. But I don't believe it should be a criminal offence. And we've got to find other ways of dealing with it. When we're dealing with hatred and hate speech and harmful communication, governments need to invest, not just regulate. Passing laws never solves complex social problems. And the kind of investments that I look for are, or first in education, starting in primary school with civics and how a democracy works, human rights, conflict resolution, non-violent conflict resolution, critical thinking, become especially important in this age of misinformation and disinformation, and media and digital literacy. So that's one place I'd start. And then I'd start with investment in civil society organisations that bring people together and create bridging social capital. the planks of a cohesive society.
When you were writing Regulating Free Speech in a Digital Age, you were actually, I believe, in Germany. And there we have a good example of a country that has had to introduce strict rules around delegitimizing toxic messages.
Germany probably has some of the most restrictive rules on free speech in Europe, for good reason. It's because of the history of Nazism and the way an authoritarian government used propaganda to stir up racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia that led to the Holocaust.
If authoritarianism is on the rise, if there are concerns about that extreme far-right fascism, why wouldn't you introduce something that protected you along the lines of what Germany has?
Because it doesn't work. The German law that's usually talked about is the Network Enforcement Act. But even with that regulation and so much else that Germany has done, around media regulation and around investment in civil society, it doesn't mean that the alt-right has disappeared from Germany or that white nationalism isn't alive and strong. When things go underground, I think that's when you need to worry. And that's also why I'm cautious about censorship proposals or the attempt to regulate content.
In your book, you actually suggest that an alternative, if you like, to regulation or censorship of some form is actually something you call counter-speech.
Yeah, counter-speech is when you are confronted with some ugly communication, and it may even be hate speech, as I've defined it, as inciting discrimination, acts of hostility or violence. And you don't keep silent about it, you speak up. And particularly in, say, social media context. And I found examples like young women who do Instagram tag cleaning, so that if somebody's had some unpleasant post put on their Instagram account, they will flood that account with positive, nice things to say, which pushes the ugly content down the feed until Instagram's moderators can deal with it.
If we're talking counter-speech, I would have thought very often the very people who are required to do that are the victims, and they're so traumatized they're at least able to help themselves.
There are times when you simply do not have the energy, or it is just unsafe to speak up. So choose your time and place. But then when we're not the target and someone else is, there are really important counter-speech strategies of standing together and showing solidarity.